Subscribe, gamers. Gamers? We are all gamers on this channel. I have so many books to get through. I can't even remember what I literally just used this book from one of my final projects and I can't remember what it's about. I went to Catholic school for 18 years. I'm a slut for a good theological debate. What's up, gamers? Welcome back to I Forgot Salt, the YouTube channel where I talk about things that I like. Today I'm going to be sort of recapping a large chunk of about 4 months of the books that I read in 2020. It's been quite a long time since I last made a video. I think middle of March maybe, or late March. A lot of stuff happened in the summer and I just sort of fell off of making YouTube videos. If you follow my recipe blog, you will sort of know a little bit of what's been going on. Long story short, there was some job shuffling. Clearly, I'm in a different spot. We've moved to a completely different town. I'm in university now, very cool. Just a lot of major life changes. And so because of that, I just sort of stopped filming. I didn't stop reading, clearly, because we have 44 books to go over in this video, which will cover everything I read from April to July, through July, and then I'm gonna do another video where I cover my fall reading, August through November, because it's December now. And I thought about maybe going over and doing each month individually, but that's a lot of filming to do after not having filmed for a really long time. I'll be totally honest, since most of these books I read at least 4 or 5 months ago, I don't entirely remember some of my nuanced points about them. So we're gonna try to go over some of these older ones a lot quicker. So hopefully this video will be not an hour and a half long. At least in the next video, when I'm talking about more recent reads, I will have more to say for those. But for these, it'll probably just be like, I read this, I liked it, it's about this, that kind of thing. And I also, you'll see when we get there, but I did not read a whole lot in July specifically, because that is the month where we were moving and I was also finishing up my first university semester. I did a lot of listening to podcasts and just listening to music. I didn't do a lot of reading. Anyway, that's enough talking. The first book I finished in April, well, not necessarily the first book I started in April, because I did start this one at the end of March, I believe, was The Library of the Unwritten by A.J. Hackwith. I gave this a 4 out of 5 star rating, and I actually just finished the sequel a month or two ago, so this one's still pretty fresh in my mind. Basically, there's a series of libraries in various afterlives of various religions and stuff. And the library that exists in the Christian personification of hell houses all books that were never finished by their authors on the real earth plane. And it follows the librarian of this unwritten wing of the library of the afterlives and her attempts to catch and bring back the character of one of these unwritten books that has escaped hell and gone to find his author on Earth. And it was just a fun adventure, magical adventure book. I enjoyed it. Again, 4 out of 5 stars. Clearly I liked it, and clearly, as you'll see, I picked up the sequel to it in October, I believe. The next book I picked up in April was The Last True Poets of the Sea by Julia Drake. This is a YA contemporary romance. It deals with, if I remember correctly, a teenage girl who is very rebellious and she is sent to live with her uncle? Probably her uncle. She goes to live with her uncle in this small coastal town that her ancestors founded, and meets quirky cast of locals who she becomes friends with. Because it's a contemporary romance, there is a love triangle in it, and it is a queer romance, so the main character is bisexual, and that is heavy in the book. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars, which is unusual for me because I don't really like romances, but it was more of a book about her and her family, how her family is coping dealing with some of the stuff that's going on in their lives. It was a surprising read for me. Surprised that I liked it, and I'm really glad that I picked it up. The next book I read in April was The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry by Gabrielle Zevin, and this was also a 4 out of 5. I had a really good reading month in April, apparently. I do remember that I read this all in one day, like in a single sitting, and I remember Alex came in like the last maybe 10 pages, and I was like crying. I was like, get out, get out. This is literary fiction, I believe. It's very like emotionally heavy. It's a really, really good book. It's basically about this guy whose wife has passed away, and he owns a bookstore, and it's just different things that happen in his life as he learns to sort of move on from his wife's death, and like different people that he meets in the town. It was just a really sweet and heartwarming read, but also like made me cry a bunch. 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. I would recommend it. The next book I read in April was probably the biggest book I read this year. It was exactly 780 pages. This was Wanderers This was Wanderers by Chuck Wendig. Considering everything that's happened this year, maybe not the wisest book to pick up, but I really loved it. This is science fiction. Basically, it's a plague story, a pandemic story that follows a bunch of different characters and how the plague sort of affects them, their families, and then as the world sort of collapses, the aftermath of that, much later on in the novel. I have to say, there were a lot of twists in this book that I did not see coming, and I understand why some people really don't like this book. If you are not a fan of Stephen King's The Stand, like it's directly referenced several times in this book that
what's happening is very similar to The Stand by Stephen King.
As sort of like a jab the author's making at himself. And I will admit, it's very similar to The Stand. I really enjoyed The Stand. I had my problems with it, and I think that Wanderers sort of remedied a lot of the problems that I had with The Stand. So that was like a big win for me with this. But there is a lot of monologuing about like the nature of life, the nature of God, what all of this means. And that'll go on for pages and pages and pages of characters just philosophizing about the things that are happening and what that means in the larger context of their universe. That could probably be very dry and very slow to readers going into this expecting like a sci-fi action plague story. But I really, really enjoyed those aspects of the book. So if that seems like it will interest you, then I would definitely pick this up. It is a huge read. I did read it in, I think, 2 or 3 days, but I just remember sitting on the couch reading this and getting it done in like a really short period of time because I just was hooked. I could not put it down. The next book I read, and we're still in April, was The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, and I gave this one a 5 out of 5 stars. This is another fantasy realism, magical realism book. So I was really stepping outside of my comfort zone in April and reading a lot of books that I wouldn't normally pick up. And again, 5 out of 5 stars, so I really, really loved this one. It follows several characters who are the personifications of different boroughs in New York City and their journey discovering that they've now become demigods and them trying to find the sort of god of New York City as a whole. That does not do the story justice at all. This, I think, is going to be part of a trilogy, but the other books in the trilogy aren't out yet. And I definitely will be rereading this before I read the sequel, just because I feel like there was a lot in it that I don't remember. But it was a 5 out of 5 stars. I really, really liked it. Yeah. The next set of books I don't physically have because I read them online, and that is volumes 21 through 26 of My Hero Academia. I typically, for longer form mangas like manga, people are gonna destroy me for mispronouncing it, but that's how I've been pronouncing it since I was like 10, so I'll do my best. For a lot of the longer form mangas, like My Hero Academia, I do read those online. I read fan translations, especially ones that I've been following for a longer period of time, just because when I started reading them, I didn't have access to buying physical volumes, or there's just so many that I can't, like I don't have the space to store. I've been reading My Hero Academia since 2015-ish, when the first season of the anime aired, and I do this with a lot of longer form mangas where in the spring or summer, I will just bulk read the chapters and volumes that have been published the previous year. It's kind of hard to like describe or rate these volumes of My Hero Academia. One, because they're so late into the series, so any synopsis would spoil events for people who aren't totally caught up with the manga. And also because they're so small, like I usually will just rate a series as a series, not individually. So My Hero Academia for me is like a 4 out of 5. I think it has like a 7 out of 10 on my anime list rating. I really like it. Clearly it's part of my yearly binge. If you don't know what it's about, if you're interested in getting into manga, I think this is a really great gateway manga. It is like longer, but the anime has only got 4 seasons at this point. Basically, it takes place in modern like Earth, but humans started being born with mutations that gave them superpowers. So now in like modern day society, things have evolved to the point where being a superhero is like a job, like a paid job. And it follows Midoriya Izuku, a high school student who was born without, so like one of the rare students who was born without superpowers, and sort of his journey to still becoming a superhero despite not having any powers. It's really fun, really like action-packed, very fast-paced. It's like really easy to get into, and I really enjoy it. I think it's pretty good. The next set of books I read, also manga, was volumes 7 through 23 of Demon Slayer, which I gave a 3 out of 5, the whole series. Volume 23 is the last volume. Again, I read fan translations up to the very end online, but I am thinking in the future maybe I want to actually collect the physical volumes just because Alex really likes it and I would love to go back and reread it with a physical copy. But again, this was a 3 out of 5. It would have probably been a 4 out of 5, but I wasn't super happy with the final, I think, volume and a half, but it was still really good. Clearly, like, I still read the whole thing. It follows a young boy who his entire family has been killed by a demon, except for his younger sister who has been turned into a demon. And it's basically his journey to defeat all of these demons up to where he can face the demon that killed his family, and also him trying to find a cure to turn his sister back into a human. It's very, very dark, kind of bloody, but also very, very fast paced, like especially the anime, which boom, 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 so much happens. This video is gonna be super long, I think, but because we're not even done with April yet. The next book I read in April was Recursion by Blake Crouch, and I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I actually had a really hard time with this book, not because it was sci-fi, but just because I didn't care. I accidentally got this book spoiled for me by another booktuber, well, several booktubers, because what I realized is different booktubers will talk about slightly different things. So if you watch a bunch of different reviews of a single book, even if they're spoiler free, in piecing together the things that different people have said, you might accidentally figure out what's going on in the book before you've even read it. So I try to be very careful about some of the videos I watch now. And I know it's my own fault. I should have been more diligent about skipping things like that. The premise is really neat. It's set in like modern day society where people are suddenly coming down with, I think it's called false memory syndrome, where they're suddenly having these memories of events that never happened put in their heads, and it like drives people crazy. And it follows a policeman who's trying to like discover what's going on, also a neuroscientist who's also trying to figure out what's going on. And I can't say a lot without spoiling it, but there are a couple of like major twists throughout the book that would have been really interesting if I hadn't known that they were coming. But I just found it really difficult to care about either of the main characters for some reason. I just felt like they were people shoveling snow. I just felt like they were really boring and bland, and I just couldn't bring myself to like them at all, so I didn't care about what they were doing. I don't think I will be picking up Dark Matter, which is Blake Crouch's other book that I've also seen a lot of praise for, but if the premise sounds interesting to you, I would definitely like check it out, but I would go in as blind as possible. Do not read the synopsis, just go in with as bare minimum knowledge as possible. The last book I read in April was The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This was a nonfiction. Earlier in 2020, I was really trying to like hit some goals of reading a nonfiction every month and, you know, reading some graphic novels every month or manga every month, and I've since fallen off that train. This was my nonfiction pick, my nonfiction pick for April, and I really liked this. I give this a 4 out of 5 stars, and I actually think for most of June I was like recommending this book to people, like, oh, if you're not into reading, pick up Radium Girls. It's a nonfiction that's told like a story, that kind of thing. But it was so interesting. I had no idea that these women existed, or that this period of American history where everybody was putting radium in everything as like a cure-all element, even though it was radioactive. That was a period of history I didn't know anything about. So that was really cool to learn about, and it was also really cool to learn about the women who handled the radium and how the consequences of handling so much radiation on a daily basis, basically it killed them all, and that their court case demanding compensation for the absolute agony that they endured was sort of the basis for all future court cases about workers' rights in America. And also the way that it's told is like you're reading a story, not like somebody's listing off a bunch of historical facts at you. So it's really like fast and easy to get through if you're not as interested in history or nonfiction as a genre. So I thought that was really cool. I thought it was really well done. I actually probably will reread this book sometime in the future. Finally, we are free of April. We're in May now.
Time is moving at a snail's pace.
The first book I read in May was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, and I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. It was okay. I think I've just figured out that maybe romance isn't the genre for me. Basically, it takes place in like an alternate present where the son of the President of the United States falls in love with the Prince of England, and their like relationship, them getting to know each other and like falling in love and stuff. It was really cute. It was cute, and that was it. Like I didn't love it the same way that a lot of other people I think really loved this book. But again, I think that's just personal preference, not really being into romance. I wanted more plot, not capital P plot, lowercase p plot. I wanted more events taking place that weren't just like, oh no, we're having a fight now. So sad. Anyway, that sounded really mean. It's not a bad book. It's really, I swear, it's just average. It's fine. It's okay. Anyway, the next book I picked up in May was Howls Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. And if you've seen some of my other videos, you know I don't rate books that I read for school because I feel like my experience in the class itself, like my opinion of the teacher and of like what's going on in the class itself, really colors my opinion of the books that I read in class. So I try not to rate those books because it might not be like a totally unbiased review if I did. Anyway, so I read this for a comparative film and literature class. It's very different from the movie. Like it's unexpectedly very different from the movie, but that doesn't make it a bad book. I much prefer a lot of the themes and the plot changes that were in Miyazaki's interpretation of Howl's Moving Castle. But it's classic middle grade fantasy. It's classic for a reason. It's very cute, very sweet. I had a lot of notes on this apparently, and my heater's kicking on. You can probably hear that now. Phenomenal. So yeah, Howl's Moving Castle, Diana Wynne Jones. Didn't rate it, but it was okay. Everything is covered in dust. Our old apartment was so dusty, and when we moved, I think we brought all of it with us. The next book I read in May was The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home by Jeffrey Cranor and Joseph Fink. This is the third book in the Welcome to Night Vale novelization series, and I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. Fucking loved it. It was so well done, but here's a caveat. It has very little to do with the Night Vale canon, like the pre-established Night Vale canon. If you aren't familiar with the Night Vale novelization series, the books in the series are non-consecutive. They don't follow the same story. They don't follow the same characters. And they also don't follow the characters, the main protagonists from the Welcome to Night Vale podcast. These are books that deal with stories about characters that live in the town of Night Vale, side characters from the original podcast. And this one, of course, is the story of the faceless old woman who secretly lives in your home. It's very different from from the 2 previous books, which are actually set within Night Vale proper. Obviously the Welcome to Night Vale, the novel, and the second was It Devours. This is like historical, surreal, Night Vale-esque. I'm having such a hard time explaining it, because how do you explain a book about a faceless old woman who secretly lives in your home? This basically is like historical fiction set in the Night Vale world. So like it's very surreal and like mystical without being magical, if that makes sense. I almost would compare not the style of writing, but the storytelling style to some of Jeff Vandermeer's work, where it's weird and not everything is explained and you just sort of have to go along with it, but you're sort of unsettled continuously throughout the story. I think this was the best novel in the whole series so far. It's really, like I said, hard to explain. Basically, it's the backstory for the faceless old woman who lives in your home, who is essentially immortal and who was once a pirate who was born in the Mediterranean, and it's her journey as sort of a, how do you explain this? It's her journey as a pirate, and then from being a pirate and like an assassin and shit to being a citizen of Night Vale who secretly lives in your home. I have no idea how to explain this. 4 out of 5 stars. You don't have to read the novels in the series in order. Admittedly, I have not. I actually started with It Devours by accident because I didn't know they were all part of the same series, and then went back and read Welcome to Night Vale, the novel, and then obviously read this one. You really need context from the original podcast to understand what's going on in the first novel in the series, but in It Devours and The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home, you really don't. You just sort of can jump into the story and be thrown about by it, as long as you're willing to sort of roll with what's going on and some of the terminology and some of the absurdity, because it's written in the style of Welcome to Night Vale without being directly connected to events in the main storyline. Again, 4 out of 5 stars. Really, really loved it. Really recommend it if you want something that's like surrealist historical fiction, because it's basically surrealist historical fiction. The next book probably needs no introduction. It was a 5 out of 5 star read, and that is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Like I said, 5 out of 5 stars. Loved this book. This is historical fiction following a fictional old Hollywood starlet, Evelyn Hugo, at the end of her life, retelling her life story to a journalist who she wants to write her memoir, giving her side of the story, not the tabloid side of the story, of her 7 marriages and which of her like partners throughout her life was her greatest love. It's so beautifully written. It was really beautiful. The story of Evelyn Hugo and her different relationships and, you know, the different kinds of love she felt for different people was just such a beautiful story to read, and I just really, really, really recommend this book, even if you don't think historical fiction is for you, because it's not like pre-20th century historical fiction. The events in the book are 50s or 40s, maybe 40s to like 70s, plus the modern day interactions between Evelyn Hugo and the journalist. My nose itches. My nose itches. Me. So hard being me. It deals with a lot of things that I didn't expect the book to deal with, especially going into it thinking it was going to just be like historical fiction romance. But it deals with like racism, sexism, especially like in 20th century America, homophobia, again, different kinds of love and what it means to love different people. It was just a really beautiful story. Really liked it. Again, 5 out of 5. The next book I read in May was A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This is a YA thriller, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I think I like adult thrillers too much to really jive with YA thrillers, just because I think they don't go hard enough, if that makes sense. Like, there were a lot of moments in this book where I was like, oh my god, this thing is gonna happen, and then I'd have to take a step back and be like, no, that wouldn't happen in a YA novel, and of course it didn't. I think this is also probably a common opinion. A lot of people who really, really like thrillers and mysteries and crime novels and things like that, that YA thrillers don't quite do it for them. poem. But that being said, it was a really pretty good book. The last quarter of the book we're just not even going to talk about. That was over here, while the rest of the book was over here. But it had good build up to the absurdity of the end. And I don't really have a lot to say about it other than it was okay, and I think I still prefer adult thrillers over YA thrillers. The next book I read in May was Beowulf by Unknown for my summer semester medieval poetry class. And again, because I don't rate books I read for school, didn't give this a rating. I will say this is the R.M. Liuza edition, probably did not pronounce that right, which is basically a direct one-to-one translation of the original poem. It's not a sort of reinterpretation into modern language. So this edition is really hard to read. And I'm just not a fan of medieval poetry in general, I think, just personally. So glad that class is over. The next book I read, I don't have a physical copy of because it was in my Unwritten anthology of medieval poetry, and it was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, again by Unknown. We read a bunch of different poems in class. We read excerpts from the Canterbury Tales, part of Paradise Lost, and all this kind of stuff. But Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf, couldn't even, that's already gone from my mind. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf were the only like complete works that we read. Others were just like excerpts or chapters. Then the next book I read was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This was my first Leigh Bardugo book, despite me owning the entirety of the Grishaverse series. I wanted to start with this one before jumping into that huge series because I had heard that if you loved the Grishaverse series, you would hate this, and I didn't want my opinions of her other series to influence my opinion of this book because the premise sounded really interesting to me. And I have to say, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it enough that I definitely will be picking up the sequel. It wasn't like groundbreaking for me, but I liked the aesthetics of it. It basically follows Alex Stern, who is a troubled teen that is admitted into Yale by scholarship that she didn't really even apply for. She gets involved in the secret society of magic users that exist sort of underground in Yale, and there's a murder and she has to solve it. The magical realism elements were interesting and they weren't so over my head that I couldn't get what was going on, but it just took a little bit of time for me to get into this book. I actually think I started it and then dropped it and then started it again because I wasn't quite following the beginning. Yeah, it was okay. 3 out of 5. Again, we'll be picking up the sequel, which I don't always do for 3 out of 5 reads, but yeah, if you are interested in the premise, I would pick it up. Hopefully this is an indication that I'll like the Grishaverse series more. Also, I have all of the books, so I need to stop buying books and not reading them. The next book I read in May was Magic for Liars by Sarah Gailey, and I give this one a 4 out of 5 stars. This one is, again, magical realism murder mystery. So I clearly was vibing with the Ninth House setting enough to pick this one up immediately after. But I actually really liked this one a lot more. While both are technically adult fantasy, this one felt a little bit more like an adult fantasy. Basically, this follows a private investigator whose sister is a witch and teaches at a magical academy. It's set in like modern day America, but there's a Harry Potter-esque secret society of witches and wizards that exist under the nose of everybody else. And there's been a murder of one of the teachers, and the private investigator's sister is brought in to investigate the murder, even though she does not have any magical powers, but her sister does. And things just sort of unfold from there. I really liked that it was told from the perspective of an outsider, so it was just really interesting, and I don't feel like you see that a lot in fantasy. And I liked the fact that it felt kind of like a murder mystery, like a thriller, which is a genre that I love, my favorite genre probably. Sarah Gailey is a really interesting writer. The way they write is pretty fast-paced, pretty straightforward, and the twists at the end are really like, oh my gosh, didn't see it coming. I did get choked up. I didn't cry, but I did get choked up towards the end of this book. Yeah, I'd recommend it for anyone who might not be as into fantasy, but prefers more like mystery novels. Really good, 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I picked up, and we're in June now, was The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert, and this is a YA fantasy novel. I actually picked this up on the recommendation of Paperback Puns, another booktuber who really loves this book, but I didn't like it as much. I understand what the appeal of this book is. It basically follows a teenager whose grandmother was a really famous this modern fairy tale writer who in her old age has basically cloistered herself in her cottage in the middle of nowhere. Her grandmother has like a cult following of people who are just obsessed with her folktale collection. The main character sort of gets tumbled into this magical world that her grandmother was inadvertently a part of, and things just sort of spiral from there. I have to say I really liked the end of this novel. I know that not everybody who liked this novel liked the ending of it, and I feel like I have the opposite opinion. I didn't really like the majority of the novel, but the ending, that stuck with me hardcore. 3 out of 5, average, okay, but I chose not to pick up the sequel, and I definitely probably won't be picking up the spin-off of this series. The next book I picked up was A Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I was stoked for this book the day it was announced and pre-ordered it, and defying all expectations, loved it. Gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. This probably one of my favorite books of the year, although I don't know where it ranks really in that. It basically follows a Southern housewife who is part of a book club, and a new guy rolls into town who's maybe a little too charming, maybe a little too willing to ingratiate himself into the families of these women, and everything spirals horribly out of control from there. If you've read any Grady Hendrix before, okay, clarify, if you've read any of Grady Hendrix's good books before, you'll know that he's very good at writing gory horror scenes, and this book definitely had a couple early on that sort of fit that. I don't know if this is gonna be spoilers or not, but that reminded me of a couple of the death scenes in Horror Store, and also the tapeworm scene in My Best Friend's Exorcism. So just like that level of almost body horror, swarming vermin horror. It's not as much to the degree as some of his other good books, that grotesque body horror sort of thing. This is definitely, I think he's toned it down a little bit. Most of the horror in this book comes just from the female protagonist not being listened to. It was sort of a domestic horror in that sense. The real horror of it is the horror of like being a woman in the South in the 1980s. The real villain is society. I really liked it. I thought it was great, and I understand why some people didn't like it, especially if you're going into this expecting like a vampire slaying action novel. But I don't know, I'm from the South and my family is all from the South, so there were a lot of things in this book that I could really like relate to, and there were things where like a character would do and I'd be like, oh my god, like my aunt does that, or like, oh my god, my mom does that. Terrifying. So like I really felt like a connection with this book just from personal experience, and also thought the story was really good and really interesting, and I like Grady Hendrix's writing style and the kind of stories he tells when he tells decent stories. 5 out of 5 stars. Highly would recommend. Highly. The next couple of books that I'm going to talk about end of June into July are pretty much all books that I read for school. I wasn't doing a lot of for fun reading at this point in the year, and also Alex and I were trying to figure out some life stuff that was going on, moving, changing jobs, changing schools, etc., etc. So a lot of my time and energy was taken up either by my condensed summer semester or by just like real life stuff. So I don't have ratings for any of these other books, except for one. Except for one, but they were all really interesting reads, and I can't say that I didn't enjoy all of them. I really did enjoy all of these books. The next book I read was No No Boy by John Okada, which is historical fiction but based on real life events. It follows a Japanese American man who, after the Japanese were sent to Japanese internment camps during World War II, was then thrown in jail for answering no on the 2 questions on the draft that basically asked, are you willing to die for your country? And also, do you swear your undying allegiance to the United States, and also forswear any allegiance you have to the Japanese emperor? And the men who checked no on both of these boxes were not willing to go to war for a country that had thrown them into concentration camps, and also had no allegiance to the Japanese emperor as Japanese American born citizens. And for resisting the draft, basically they were all thrown in jail. So it follows the main character after he's released from jail, and sort of how his family reacts to the decision he made, how the people around him react to the decision he made. It's very hard to get through, but it is really, really worth the read. The author, John Okada, this was the only book that he wrote, I believe, in the 1950s. He wrote this in 1957, so a lot of the real life events covered in the book were very, very fresh in the minds of the people that would have been reading it. When he took it to publishers, they said, we don't want this, no one will read this. This is like, who wants to read about the plight of Japanese Americans in America? So he didn't publish it for years and years and years until it was rediscovered, I believe, after his death, during a movement in the 1970s, 1980s to find Asian American literature and to have that be a recognized subgenre of American literature. So this book was rediscovered and then published. And then it turned out that John Okada had started writing a second book and had come across the same problem of not being able to get it published. And instead of sort of storing the manuscript away, he actually destroyed his second manuscript. So this is the only surviving work of his. This is considered part of the 20th century classic American literature canon. I'm not entirely sure what the distinctions are. So this is definitely a must read if you're interested in like American classics. The next book I read was also from my Asian American literature class, and that was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. Now, I did mention that I don't give any books I read for school ratings, except for books that I feel are exceptional 5-star reads for me on a personal level, not just an academic level. So this was a 5-star read. I did give it 5 stars. I've actually ended up reading this twice this year for 2 separate classes. Cried throughout the book both times I had to read it. This book follows a family in the 1970s, 1977 I think, whose 16-year-old daughter, it opens with the 16-year-old daughter having died, and the family discovering that she has passed away. And it just sort of is the family dynamic that emerges after her death, the different interpersonal conflicts between the two parents, Marilyn and James, and the 2 surviving children. And then you get flashbacks of Marilyn and James as a young couple, them growing up and then meeting, and then different flashes of the 3 children as they're growing up, all leading up to Lydia's death. Yeah, this was just a phenomenal book. Probably one of my favorites. Moving into July, I actually only have 2 books that I read in July, again, because we were moving and there was just a lot going on. And the first one was Native Speaker by Chang Rae Lee. This is YA apparently, but I disagree with that categorization personally. I think this should be adult or should be classified as adult. This follows a Korean American man who is recruited by a Secret Service-like private agency to shadow and befriend a Korean American politician, sort of influence what his politics are at the whim of his employer's client, who may have motives going against a lot of the progressive ideals that this Korean American politician is supporting. It sounds like adventure-y, action-y, mystery spy, whatever. It's not at all. This is a commentary on the intergenerational conflicts between Korean immigrants and their Korean American children, about the racism between different minorities and the way that white America treats different minorities. There's a lot of political commentary in it. You'll get halfway through the novel and forget that you're technically reading a spy novel because there's just so much to unpack. This was not at all what I expected. I did really enjoy it, and I probably will go back and read it again in the future when I've removed enough from the class that I took it for. And the last book I read in April to July, the 44th book of all of this, was a short story collection by Junpa Lahiri, interpreter of Maladies, and it is 9 collected short stories dealing with the issues that Indian immigrants face in America. If you're looking for recommendations of individual stories themselves, I think my favorite story of the whole collection was either The Third and Final Continent or Mrs. Sen's. The Third and Final Continent deals with a man who has lived in the UK and then moves to the US, and he's part of an arranged marriage, and his wife then, comes to the US with him, and it's just the interactions that he has with his landlady as he's preparing for his wife to move to the United States with him. And the Mrs. Sen's is the story of a middle-aged woman who moves to the United States because her husband has found a job as a professor at a university, but she is a stay-at-home wife, a housewife, and it sort of deals with her struggles to adjust to life in America after leaving her family, her friends, her life in India. And it's told from the perspective of a young boy who she becomes the babysitter for, basically, as her sort of side job while she's trying to adjust to to life in America. Really interesting collection of stories. I really enjoyed all the stories. And yeah, so that's basically it. That was all 44 books I read from April through July. I'm gonna be making another video pretty soon detailing my fall reads, just collecting those all in a similar video from August through to November. This is really fun to do. I'm really hoping to get back into making videos for BookTube because like I said, never really stopped reading. I just stopped making videos. So look out for that video soon. I'm hoping to do a little bit of like a Bookmas thing too, a very condensed and shortened Bookmas. With these two videos, then my sort of 2020 wrap up, and then maybe like a planned TBR for January, or books that I want to read in 2021, maybe anticipated 2021 releases. I have a bunch of ideas, but I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to execute them all yet. But I don't know, we're going on this journey together. We're feeling this out. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, gamers. Hit that bell, you know, leave a comment below. Gamers, we are all gamers on this channel. Anyway, yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.